In this video, I want to talk about the Russian missile attacks on Ukraine. In the last week, we've seen some of the biggest and most intense strikes on Ukraine in the whole war. So let's talk about it. Over the last couple of weeks, there have been some very spectacular events. First, Ukraine shot down 5 Russian fighter jets in just a few days, and they did it with some very long-ranging weapons. I made a video about that. Then Ukraine also made a very successful attack on the Russian landing ship Novocherkassk. The ship was hit in the port of Feodosia on Crimea, and it was totally destroyed. These landing ships are very often thought of as amphibious assault vessels, and they can also do that thing where they sail all the way onto the beach and they unload a bunch of soldiers. But actually, they are usually more used as logistical support vessels because they're also very good for that. And it looked like Novocherkassk was being used for transportation of ammunition when it was hit because the explosion was enormous. It was much bigger than what a cruise missile alone can do. It was probably a British Storm Shadow or a French Scalp missile. It's basically the same missile, just different names. But these missiles are the only ones that Ukraine has that have the kind of range where it can hit Feodosia. And that's also why it's so frustrating to hear the German government talking about why they don't think Ukraine needs the Taurus missile, which has about the same capability. I mean, how can you look at the destruction of this Russian landing ship and say that you don't think these kinds of weapons make a difference and that Ukraine would benefit from having more? But those Ukrainian successes were quickly followed by the Russian drone and missile strikes that hit across many cities in Ukraine. These have been some of the biggest missile attacks in the whole war. It's even bigger than in the first days of the invasion. So clearly there is something special going on. I saw some people suggested that maybe it was revenge for the attack on the landing ship, but I would say that's probably not the case. This was a planned event. Russia has been planning for a long time that they would have an air campaign during the winter, just like they did last winter. So at least I would say that the attack in itself was not revenge. This is just Russia's winter campaign against the Ukrainian society, so the attack was going to happen anyways. And maybe it was a question of adjusting the timing a bit to make it look like revenge, but frankly, I think the timing was probably also more about hitting right before the New Year celebration. But this winter, Russia has had a different approach than they did last winter. Last winter, they had a very long and very protracted campaign where they started already in October, and then there were attacks about every other week. So Russia's plan was that this would wear down the Ukrainian infrastructure over time, and it would undermine the Ukrainian determination to fight. But that kind of incremental approach didn't work. The Ukrainians were very good at repairing the damages, and over time they also managed to build a pretty good air defense. So overall, the Russian winter air campaign last year didn't achieve its goals. So that is one of the reasons why they are doing it differently this year. Instead of having this sort of incremental approach with a lot of smaller attacks over time, they try this different approach where they have massive attacks and they try to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense. So what we have seen is that sometime around September, Russia stopped using their missiles. They still made some drone attacks across Ukraine, but they stopped using missiles. And they did that so that they could save up some stockpiles so that they could have enough to make these massive attacks where they blow off hundreds of missiles in a few days. It is estimated that Russia's production capacity is somewhere around 100 missiles per month, so they can't do this all the time. They need to prepare for these big attacks, and they have to save up the missiles. The way the attack works is that at its core that they fire so many drones and missiles that it's impossible for Ukraine to shoot down all of them. So when we hear that the Ukrainians have shut down most of the missile, then that is not necessarily a sign that the attack is a failure for Russia, because they would probably have expected that to happen, and it may be fine for them that, say, 1 in 4 missiles will get through the air defense. Compared to last year, Ukraine now has a much better air defense. They have received many more systems from the West, so Ukraine has some of the best air defense in the world. But I think some people have misunderstood that as meaning that Ukraine is in a better position to deal with these Russian attacks. And that is not necessarily the case because Russia also has more missiles and drones compared to last year. They have the missiles they've saved up over many months before these attacks, but they also have the drones, the Shahid drones. They were new for Russia last winter, and they didn't have very many, but now they do. Originally, they were thought of as Iranian drones, but now Russia has a domestic production of them, and they produce a lot. And even though they're smaller than the missiles and they're easier to shoot down, they are still a big problem because there are so many of them. So I think it's an open question who is in a better position this year compared to last year to win the air battle. But I will say this, I think the Ukrainian society is probably less vulnerable to these attacks that hit the critical infrastructure, like the power system, for example, because the society would be better prepared for this to happen. People have made plans now. They have power banks. They have power generators. And the Ukrainian government has also had time now to secure the energy system. So there would be air defenses around critical infrastructure, for example. And that leads me to talking a bit about what it is that Russia is trying to hit in these attacks. I see a lot of people saying that Russia is trying to hit civilian targets and that they're only blowing up civilian objects. And it is true that we've seen a lot of pictures of destroyed apartment buildings and churches and hospitals and children's playgrounds, and maybe Russia is targeting that. I think to some extent they are. But I do want to say a few things about that because I don't think it's the only thing they're targeting. I also think they do target also valid military targets. So the first thing I want to point out is that we only see pictures when it is a civilian object that is destroyed. We never see pictures of destroyed military installations or factories that produce military equipment. And the reason for that is not so much that the Ukrainians are trying to hide it or to spin it to make it look like the Russians only hit civilian objects and commit war crimes. The reason is more that you never want to give your enemy knowledge about whether an attack was successful or not, because that helps them do what is called battle damage assessment, where you assess whether the goal of the attack was achieved or if you need to send another missile. So if there is an important military installation that is hit or was a target, then the Ukrainians definitely don't want those pictures in the media. So that is one reason why we only see images of civilian objects. Another reason why civilian objects get destroyed may be air defense. First, of course, the air defense missiles that don't hit a target can cause some damage when they fall down on the ground. That's what they say all the time on Russian TV, that all these civilian damages are caused by the Ukrainian air defense because the Ukrainians don't know what they're doing. So that is their story. It's probably not a very likely explanation because air defense missiles are supposed to have a safety mechanism so that they self-destruct if they don't hit the target. But it can happen, of course, that these things don't work like they're supposed to and that they cause some damage when they fall down. But the air defense can also cause some random damage in the sense that the Russian missiles that are shot down will land in some pretty random places. And if they're shot down over a city, then they can hit an apartment building, for example. So that is a possibility. And then finally, a very important reason that I think is often overlooked is the effect of electronic warfare. Many of the important military installations and the critical infrastructure will be protected by electronic jammers. So when the missile attacks, then the jammer will interfere with the navigation system and the missile will miss the target. And that obviously means that the missile or the drone will hit something other than what it was aiming for. And I just think it's really important that we all the time keep these things in mind when we have these cases where a missile or a drone has hit something that looks like a civilian object. It's not necessarily because the soldiers wanted to hit that thing that they hit. It's also possible that the missile was jammed and missed the target, or that it was shot down and just landed in some random place. And this is the same regardless whether it's a Russian attack or a Ukrainian attack. So when a Ukrainian drone hits what looks like a civilian building in Moscow, then it's quite likely that it was jammed. And it's the same thing when Russian drones and missiles hit in Ukraine. We should expect that many of them were jammed and that they missed their targets. And I think it's become a kind of pattern in this war that when there are these Russian missile strikes, then there's a lot of focus on the civilian damages, and people are saying that the Russians are so stupid because they waste their weapons on targets that don't have any military value. And sometimes that is true. I'm still confounded by how many drones they have wasted on bombing piles of grain. But I will also say that sometimes later it comes out that they also did bomb some military targets. So that is my expectation that that would be the case here too. They're not only bombing playgrounds and churches and hospitals, but probably there are also missiles that had military targets. And in fact, the British intelligence, they every day published this 3-bullet PowerPoint, but they also came out and said that the most likely primary target of these attacks was the Ukrainian defense industry. And of course, we don't know how big the damages were and how many of those missiles that hit the target, but I think we should assume that the defense industry was probably the most important target in these attacks. I want to finish off with just a few thoughts about the motives for these attacks and why is Russia doing it. And I want to mention 3 reasons. The first one is that it forces Ukraine to spend a lot of resources on air defense and protection of the cities that are far from the front line. If there weren't this danger of airstrikes, then Ukraine could use these air defense systems on the front line, or they could spend the money on something else. But Russia wants to force them to spend these resources on air defense. The second reason is that they want to hurt Ukraine's defense industry. The Russians know that this is a war of attrition, and Ukraine's domestic production is getting more and more important, especially because the West has been struggling to deliver the quantities of weapons that Ukraine needs. And the last reason is that it is intended to have a domestic effect inside of Russia. It's popular in Russia when they make these attacks, and it makes Putin look strong and in control. And that is, of course, important with the upcoming presidential election. They really want Putin to look strong and like he's winning the war. And that's also why I think some of these missiles probably were intended to hit civilian targets, because the Russians know that they will not get any good television out of bombing military objects, because the Ukrainians won't show that. So they make sure that there are some civilian targets also there, so they will get some footage for TV. But that does not mean that they only bomb civilian targets. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful, please give it a like, and also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.